Coming Home from the Life of Langston Hughes, a literally cultured read aloud, written and illustrated by Floyd Cooper. James Langston Hughes was a dreamer there in Lawrence, Kansas, where he lived alone with his grandma, Mary Langston. Langston was a dreamer in the fields behind the two-room house he shared with her, or on the porch. His grandma didn't much like him playing with the neighborhood kids, so he'd hear kids playing ball or riding bikes, but he'd stay put. Mostly in his early years, James Langston Hughes was alone. Unless the distant, faint, familiar sound of a freight train pressed against his ears. Then Langston would bolt off the porch, hit the ground running, chickens aflutter. Quick past the woodshed, swoop around the pump for drawing water. He'd hurry across the vacant lot and through the wheat field. He'd run and run until between breaths he could see the big freighter pulling its load around the curve of tracks, whistle blowing sweet, as it screeched and clanked, clackety-clackety-clackety, the old rusty cars talking. The old iron snake would tell him its stories about the places it'd been. Langston would talk back, dream back. He'd dream of riding the train to Mexico, where his pa, James Nathaniel Hughes, went to live after they wouldn't let him be a lawyer in Oklahoma, because he was a black man. He'd dream of riding to where his ma, Carrie Hughes, was trying to be an actress on stage. He loved going to the theater with her those times he had the chance to be with her. Mostly, he dreamed of the three of them together, of having a home with his ma and pa, a home he would never have to leave. But each time the train would trail off, getting quieter and quieter, and quieter still, engine smoke barely clinging to the blue sky before it disappeared. Langston's dreams disappeared too. Living with Grandma wasn't easy. She was poor. Dinner was often dandelion greens and whatever the neighbors passed over the backyard fence. Sometimes the neighbors passed clothes too, their used dresses, worn shirts, and old shoes. Once Langston had to wear a woman's shoes because his grandma couldn't buy him new ones. But Grandma believed a boy needed heroes, and one day she took Langston all the way to Topeka to hear Booker T. Washington speak. Booker T. Washington, in person. And she would read to young Langston and storytell. Sometimes she'd read from the Bible. Other times it would be a beautiful tale from the Brothers Grimm. Almost always, his grandma told stories of heroes who were black, just like Langston. His grandma's first husband, Lewis Sheridan Leary, had ridden with John Brown and was killed in the struggle to free slaves. She still wore his torn, bullet-riddled shawl. Even on warm summer evenings, she'd pull the shawl over Langston and tell him stories of her first husband, and of two uncles who were Buffalo soldiers, named that by the Indians because of their curly hair, and called the bravest of the brave. And about Langston's uncle, John Mercer Langston, the first Black American to hold office. He was a lawyer and later elected to Congress. His grandma herself had worked on the Underground Railroad, helping slaves flee north to freedom, and she told him those stories. Langston would hear these stories over and over, wrapped in the torn shawl and wrapped in family stories of pride and glory. He'd listen and dream. Sometimes Langston's dreams about having a family came true, like the time he, his ma, and grandma really did go to Mexico to see his father. Maybe, finally, Langston would have a home of his own. But on April 14, 1907, the ground in Mexico began to tremble. Everything shook, including the building they were in. Langston's pa, carrying Langston, led everyone out into the street. Everywhere walls of buildings cracked and split open. Giant tarantula spiders scurried out of the cracks. That was enough for his mama. As soon as the trains were running again, she and his grandma and Langston climbed back on the train and rode back to Kansas. Langston whispered a goodbye to Mexico, his father, and to having a home of his own. Sometimes Langston's ma would send for him. He'd ride the train to the Kansas City Bottoms where she'd meet him, and off they'd go. They'd see plays, the opera, and visit the library, where Langston was fascinated by the big, bright, silent reading room, the long, smooth tables, and librarians who would so kindly get books for him. Sometimes when she was busy, his mother would leave him at his Uncle Dez's barber shop. He liked it there, right in the center of the Black District. He'd go and wander the nearby streets, speak to folks passing by. A nod here, a hat tip there. But mostly, Langston would listen. He'd ride his ears around the city, through Market Street where everyone sang the Song of Haggle, down side streets filled with kids who ran and played forever, up the block where clubs and dance halls played jazzy old blues music that drifted down the alleys and tickled his soul. Langston felt the rhythms. Other times, Langston's ma would come to Lawrence. Once, it wasn't the best of times for her. Money was scarce. She snapped at Langston, and it hurt. Later that evening, they went to St. Luke's Church where Langston's ma was giving a performance. She told him that she had a wonderful surprise for him, that he was going to be on the stage with her, that he was going to be a star, just like she was going to be. Langston did not like the surprise. That evening, he was the one with the surprise. As his ma introduced him, behind her back, Langston made faces. He crossed his eyes, stretched his mouth, and imitated her. Everyone burst out laughing. The more people laughed, the more faces he made. Embarrassed, his mother rushed off stage. As Langston's grandma got on in years, she grew more and more silent. Then the time came when she hardly spoke at all. The little home where he had lived so long was quiet and lonely, with Grandma rocking silent in her rocking chair. A real home seemed less than ever like something Langston would ever have. Then he went to live with friends of the family across town. Auntie and Uncle Reed, he called them. When Langston first saw the dinner table at the Reeds, he had never seen so much food in his life. After the blessing, Uncle Reed smiled and told Langston to eat up. He didn't have to tell Langston twice. Then Auntie, in a voice as sweet as dessert, said that there was more out in the kitchen. Langston soon learned that there would always be more from Auntie and Uncle Reed. More food and more hugs and love. On Sundays, Auntie Reed would take Langston to church. He'd never gone before. Auntie Reed's church was all right, but in time, Langston preferred the Baptist church down the street. The singing and preaching felt so familiar, like the rhythms of the streets in Kansas City. The words seemed to roll out of the preacher's mouth like jazzy old blues. He had trouble understanding what everyone was feeling when they felt God, but he liked being there. By now, Langston had grown popular at school, was thought of as smart, and chosen class poet. He had begun writing poetry and sharing it. One of his first poems was When Sue Wears Red, about a girl he admired in school. And then he wrote Just Because I Loves You, and The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Now after school, he'd run and play with friends. Sometimes afterward, they'd gather around Langston on the Reed's front porch. There in the dark shadows of a summer night, Langston would tell stories. Of the time he stood 10 feet from Booker T. Washington. Of his 2 uncles who were Buffalo soldiers, the bravest of the brave. Of John Mercer Langston, the U.S. Congressman. About his grandma's first husband who was killed with John Brown trying to free the slaves. And of Grandma herself, who used to work on the Underground Railroad. Stories of real heroes who were black, just like Langston. It grew clearer to Langston in those days what home really was. Life with his grandma had never been exactly like home. Life with his ma and pa never had been home, as much as he wanted it to be. Life with his auntie and Uncle Reed felt like home. It smelled like home and looked like home. And home was all of the things the Reeds' home was. But home was something more for him. For him, home was a blues song sung in the pale evening night on a Kansas City street corner. Home was the theater where his ma performed, the library where he sat quiet, reading the books he loved. Home was the church, alive with music, where everybody was brother and sister. As he grew older, Langston Hughes wrote more and more about everyday people, common folk. He wrote about dancers and children, troubled people and people in love, Walt Whitman and the Black Pierrot, all kinds of people. And he traveled all over the world, to Russia and France and to Africa, experiencing the stories and rhythms of yet other people. He lived in many cities in America, like Cleveland and Los Angeles, but Harlem, New York, where all kinds of black artists gathered, writers, painters, musicians, became the place where he stayed longest and that he knew best. It seemed Langston Hughes had finally found a home. But the truth is, Langston never had a home like most people. Home was in him. And it was about his black family that he wrote in words that reached his own people, and all kinds of people of different races and different countries all over the world.